Well, I'd like to welcome all of you to the wonderful occasion that we have before us this afternoon. As you all know, this is a book launch, a celebratory book launch, and the book that we are launching today is a book that's really extraordinarily special, both because of the new field it creates, as you'll hear from some of our panelists, but also there's a reason in the history of Princeton in particular why it's really important for us to be here to launch this book today. The book and the person that we'll be talking about today is none other than the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence Emeritus from Princeton, Walter F. Murphy. And Walter Murphy is sitting right over here. We're going to give him a chance to talk about his book in just a little while, and we're very pleased to welcome him back to Princeton. As many of you know, Walter retired from Princeton some years back, and he moved out to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he's had a very good time, but we've all missed him here. So we're always looking for every excuse to bring Walter back to Princeton, and the publication of his really sort of masterwork book, Constitutional Democracy, Creating and Maintaining a Just Political Order, provides us with really a perfect reason to do so. Now, the book, Constitutional Democracy, as you'll hear from our fellow panelists today, is really an extraordinary work. Those of you who know Walter Murphy's career will know that he's been in the forefront of many important changes in the field of public law and the discipline of political science. Walter Murphy was one of the very first to start introducing the idea of strategic behavior and bargaining on the Supreme Court about a decade and a half before the rest of the discipline got around to thinking that that was a useful way to think about politics more generally. Walter was one of the very first people among American political scientists to realize that the way political science departments were set up was that law was one of those things that happened in America, but law wasn't one of those things that happened in the rest of the world, because comparative politics was overwhelmingly not focused on law. And so Walter was one of the first people to launch the field of comparative law in the discipline of political science, and the discipline followed another decade and a half to 2 decades later. We can say this about many episodes of Walter's life, but the present book, I suspect, is going to be another one of those books. Because you read the book, one of the interesting things about this book is that it's a totally fascinating read. Much of it is actually a fictionalized account of an imaginary constitutional convention populated by folks who, well, if you know the field, you might be able to guess who they are, but Walter's improved upon their arguments and put them into dialogue with each other. So much of the book reads like a work of fiction. And so one of the things if you know the discipline of political science these days, you'll know that much of political science doesn't read like works of fiction, and that this style of writing is something that's really quite unusual in the discipline right now. And this form of active construction and engagement, the improvement and setting into dialogue with each other important ideas, is something from which I think the discipline can benefit. And one of the things I only hope is that, as with Walter's other works, this is a sign of where the discipline is going to be a decade and a half, 2 decades from now. So you heard it here first, and you can look at what the field does sometime from now, but here again we have a work that really is an extraordinary work for the singularity of its vision in this particular moment. We've put together a group of people to discuss Walter Murphy's book today, who have, each of them, various relationships with both Walter and the book. First of all, I actually didn't say I'm Kim Scheppele, Director of the Program in Law and Public Affairs at Princeton University. I'm one of the 3 program heads who have been putting together this program, also with Steve Macedo, Director of the Center for the University Center for Human Values, and Robbie George, Head of the Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. All 3 institutions are bringing you the panel today. Our panelists are people who have known Walter for some time, and in fact, since the book is just out, we probably expect that most of you have not yet read it because it's hardly made it into bookstores. And so what we have as a set of panelists are people who had occasion to read the book as it was being written for various reasons. And you'll see in the program that is available on the back table, you'll see everyone's official biographies. What I want to add to that, in just a brief introduction, are people's relational biographies, or what everyone on the panel has in common with Walter Murphy. And I may be leaving some things out here, but people can correct me if I've left something out. Sot Barber, our first speaker for today, is from the University of Notre Dame. He's one of the co-editors of the American Constitutional Interpretation casebook that Walter has written with Jim Fleming and in the past Will Harris and now Steve Macedo, a book that's really transformed the study of constitutional law at the undergraduate level in the United States. So Sot's a co-author with Walter. Sot was also the original editor of this book for Johns Hopkins University Press, and he carried the editorial work through from start to finish. Mark Brandon, who's now at Vanderbilt University, was a student of Walter's here at Princeton, was a preceptor for Walter, and is someone that I know has continued to think of Walter really as his mentor and very much as his guide in this field, and we're happy to welcome him back to Princeton. Jim Fleming is also a former student of Walter's, and as I said, another co-author on the American Constitutional Interpretation book. Jim is also a former preceptor of Walter's and someone who has been carrying on Walter's tradition now from Fordham Law School, where he's presently teaching. Jeff Tulis is, again, another student and colleague of Walter's who has been working in this field and as someone who has been carrying on Walter's legacy. Jeff is now the editor of the series in which Walter's book has been published, and so he also is here in his role as co-editor of the book. And finally, Keith Whittington, who's currently of Princeton, is another person who has really deepened, I think, Walter's tradition, carried on Walter's legacy, and as he informed us over lunch, it was Walter's retirement that made his job possible. So he has a very clear relationship to Walter, and we're thrilled to have Keith with us today. So as you can see, we have a number of commentators who are all part of the Walter Murphy tradition at Princeton, and they will describe to you both what the book does and perhaps also what it doesn't do. And so with that, let me turn the floor over to Sot Barber for our first commentator.
At lunch today, Walter made a statement that indicated that he would like for people to talk less about the book than to talk about the problems that the book talks about, the opportunities that the book talks about. So in that spirit, let me just take about 3 or 4 minutes to tell you what I think is the most important part of the book, and especially the most important part of the book for this audience here at Princeton. The general topic of this panel is constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance. And I want to talk about that, but also connect it to a problem which is perhaps deeper than constitutional interpretation, and that is constitutional maintenance when constitutional interpretation fails. The preamble of the Constitution describes the Constitution as an instrument of social ends: domestic tranquility, the general welfare, the common defense, and so forth. This instrumental view of the Constitution pervades the Federalist Papers. In Federalist number 45, Madison connects it to the governing thought of the Declaration of Independence. The governing thought of the Declaration of Independence being, governments are made for people. People aren't made for government. This thought has implications for constitutional interpretation. Madison suggests in the Federalist number 40 that legal axioms and common sense agree that we should construe instrumental documents with an eye to advancing their ends, and that where the language of the document will not admit a functional construction, we should sacrifice the means to the ends because the ends are more important than the means. Again, governments are made for people, not people for governments. Madison thus implies that fidelity to the law is fidelity to what's most important about the law, or to what's most important in the law, namely the ends or purposes the laws envision, the ends in light of which the laws make sense. Interpretation, the act of interpretation, is supposed to make sense of the Constitution and its parts, supposed to make sense of the Constitution as a whole, and supposed to make sense of its individual provisions or parts. Sometimes interpretation fails because the language of the document will bear no construction that will redeem the preamble's promise, the Constitution's promise, the promise of institutions adequate to their purposes. On these occasions, the Constitution is prescriptively silent. Taken as a whole, it issues conflicting commands, like defend the nation, but don't abridge speech or suspend the writ of habeas corpus, except in cases of actual rebellion or invasion. All of this leaves us in the dark when we, or when our representatives, believe that we can't do these two things at once. We can't win the war without abridging speech and suspending the writ of habeas corpus except as prescribed. The only thing that constitutional maintenance can mean on these occasions of prescriptive silence is doing what one can do to restore the social conditions for the Constitution's prescriptive voice. The world conditions under which you can win wars without abridging speech or suspending the writ. So, at some level, the rule of law needs public-spirited and competent leadership. Despite Madison's statements to the contrary, checks and balancing private incentives will not cultivate the needed political virtues, will not cultivate the needed political leadership. Maybe Madison realized this when later in his career he called for a national university. He called for a national university to cultivate the kinds of skills and attitudes needed to perpetuate our system of government, the kinds of skills and attitudes that were, he said, quote, almost quote, foundational to the social fabric. As the nation's problems begin to raise questions about impending constitutional failure, the requisite leadership seems to be nowhere in sight. And therefore, somebody needs to look for substitutes for Madison's proposal, substitutes for the national university that he called for in vain. Programs in constitutional studies may function as such substitutes. No group in the country is better situated to promote such programs than as the groups we find here at Princeton. The institutes that we find here at Princeton. Kim's program, Steve's program, and the Madison program. Walter's book shows the way, and I think we should get busy.
This is an impressive book. It's learned and humane, and these are two characteristics that some don't often appear together. It's full of practical wisdom, and even the footnotes are interesting. In thinking about the various challenges of creating and maintaining a constitutional democracy, Walter is sensitive to the fragility of the enterprise. And one thing I especially like about the book is that he recognizes that the possibility of failure lurks continually beneath the surface, not quite like the dark forces beneath the surface of a David Lynch movie, but lurking nonetheless. Now, despite the recognition of the possibility of failure, Walter is not unduly preoccupied with the problem of failure. And in fact, there's a poignant courage in his measured lessons on ways to build and to persist. Now, one special challenge that a constitutional democracy faces, and it's one that I want to focus on, which is not directly constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance, but it is indirectly connected. One special problem is creating citizens, and the challenge is to make citizens whose virtues fit the political order. fit a polity in which membership is at least partly voluntary and whose operation depends on what Alexander Hamilton called reflection and choice. Now, the virtues of citizenship in an order of this sort are familiar. Stephen Macedo's done work in this area, and Walter's treatment of creating citizens is especially illuminating. Knowledge, reason, the ability to persuade, self-restraint, the willingness to embrace a value of equal concern and respect for fellow citizens. Now, it is the immediate aim of civic education, of political education, as Walter calls it, to transmit these virtues. But the ultimate aims of political education are essentially twofold. At the individual level, the development of civic personality. And in fact, at one point, Walter suggests that the aim of a new leadership in a constitutional democracy is to change souls. But at the social level, the ultimate aim is the creation of a fit political culture. And all of this, as Walter notes, is a job, or Walter argues, is a job that requires unity of command, a unity of purpose, and it is, in important respects, a job for the state. Now, having said that, Walter recognizes at least a couple of problems, and one has to do with the status of persons whom we've come to, some have come to call discrete or insular minorities. And the other is that there is a frequent fine line between education and indoctrination. And so Walter asks, is there a genuine difference between civic education in a constitutional democracy and the various forms of indoctrination practiced by other less desirable regimes? Now, some scholars insist there's nothing to worry about here for a variety of reasons, and I respect the arguments that those scholars have made. But Walter worries, and I think rightly so. Still, in the end, he settles, I think, on a policy that places in the state primary and ultimate responsibility for civic education while reserving a residual but distinctly partial authority for parents and guardians who may elect to educate their children in private schools. Now, there's a lot to say about both the concept of political or civic education as constitutional maintenance, and there's a lot to say about Walter's particular conceptions of the concept. But I will limit myself to 3 points, I hope briefly. One has to do with plurality and unity. If I remember correctly, and it's been a long time, so forgive me, Aristotle urged that plurality was a valuable thing in a well-constructed polity. I think that's right, and I think Walter thinks that's right. But Walter had urged us to think about ways in which the ideas of the book have incited us, and this provokes me to wonder, how do we resolve the tension between plurality on the one hand and the unity of purpose and command that Walter presses on the other? I want to have a continuing conversation about that, and the book so nicely lays out the normative and institutional terrain that I'm interested to have that continuing conversation with Walter about that. Second, the dangers of attachment. Walter urges that maintaining constitutional democracy depends on individuals' attachment to the polity and the nation, and perhaps more strongly, at least among a subset of citizens, depends upon positive loyalty to the constitutional order. And there's no doubt but that this is so. So, on Walter's account, one function of civic education or political education is not simply to transmit knowledge, not simply to transmit or cultivate capacities, but also to engender and cultivate this attachment and this loyalty to the order. And this is, I guess, in some ways the part of civic education that aims, again in Walter's terms, at changing souls. Now, I worry, my worry, and I hope it's not just a perverse worry, although it may be a perverse worry. My worry is that it's possible and potentially dangerous to love on the terms of constitutional democracy, to love polity and nation too much. And we can think about this worry in a couple of ways. One is actually internal to the argument that Walter makes in the book. And I may be misstepping here, but here's the pitch. If the foundational value of the order is human dignity, then why place a premium, I'll put it starkly, why place a premium on citizenship and on civic education? Would it not be the basic goal of an order whose cornerstone is human dignity to create not necessarily or not merely citizens, but human beings, humane beings, persons, that is, who are capable of being non-citizens and even anti-citizens when the situation demands. From a different perspective, perhaps to a similar end, is the constitutionalist theory of John Locke. Locke worried about the problems, like Walter, Locke worried about the problems of authorizing, directing, and constraining political power. One element of Locke's solution was the notion that the people, possess a residual power to declare a standing government dissolved and to replace it with a government more consistent with their needs or aspirations. Now, to me, it matters not whether from the standpoint of either human dignity or Lockean resistance, it matters not whether the aim is conservative to preserve values or ways of life that are abating, or whether the aim is essentially at radical change. Either way, there's a danger, it seems to me, a potential danger at least, if the citizen's core identity and attachment not only center on the state, but are also determined by the state. There's a danger, that is, when the state has the capacity to constitute the very citizens or persons on whom it relies for its own authority. And I wonder whether that might suggest that we pay special attention to the status of civic education itself and the role of the state in determining the scope and content of that education. Now, finally, in this last point, I am interested in actually, for me, revisiting an issue that has had me concerned for some time, and that is the constitution of political culture and institutional relations, especially in the United States and especially today. They're distinct topics in their own right, but they do connect indirectly with this problem of political education. Walter claims at one point, if I've got the argument right, Walter claims that constitutional democracies, at least mature constitutional democracies, tend not to fight one another. And I think as a tendency, that's probably apt. But it's not to say that mature constitutional democracies don't go to war, as we all know. They do. In fact, the U.S. has been at war or in significant armed conflict in one form or another for much of its corporate life and for almost all of the past 100 years. It's not my purpose to worry about the causes of this condition or to question the motives of people who pursued armed conflict. My concern is with the consequences of this commitment to war as a way of life, almost. And so here's the question. Continual war, I want to propose, alters the civic landscape in at least two significant ways. Now, one way concerns political culture. Citizens of a constitutional democracy have incentives, I believe, given the nature of constitutional democracy, have an incentive to see themselves and their nation as being essentially peaceful. But when the nation is continually at war, they have to adapt, or they are impelled to adapt psychologically to this condition. Now, Carl Schmitt helps to explain one aspect of this adaptation, and that is the development of a kind of we-they form of thinking. In short, if I may, the patriotic personality, a collective personality that, in short terms, loves nation and polity too well. And that, I think, again, is a problem from the standpoint of constitutional democracy. The second way in which the civic landscape is affected, I think, is institutional, essentially. Institutions in a nation at war adapt themselves to those conditions. Suppression of deliberation, restriction of public information, exaltation of the executive over legislative, reinforcement of the notion, if sovereignty still has uses, reinforcement of the notion that sovereignty resides in nation state and not in the people themselves. Now, these institutional adaptations, I think, weaken some of the very points of civic education or political education that Walter quite correctly sees as integral to the maintenance of a constitutional democracy. And continual war, I think, erodes both the habits of the heart of political culture and the institutional practices that are elements of constitutional democracy. So those are just a few thoughts, a few of many that Walter has provoked me to reflect upon. And in offering them, I can't do justice to Walter's sensitive analysis. But I'll close by just saying this is a wise and excellent book. Any citizen can learn from it, and certainly anyone who would presume to rule others should take it to heart.
It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today to celebrate the publication of Walter's magnum opus, Constitutional Democracy. Any reader will be awed by its learning, and it brims with theoretical and practical wisdom, well deserving the name jurisprudence. Now, I want to make two opening remarks that will follow anecdotally on Mark's closing remarks, and then make 3 points about constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance. First, a remark about constitutional democracy, Walter's signature formulation and the apt title of his book. Walter famously argues that the American constitutional order is a constitutional democracy, a hybrid of constitutionalism and democracy, rather than a majoritarian representative democracy. This formulation set me and a whole generation of Walter's graduate students down the right path, for it enabled me to avoid the confused and fruitless fretting about judicial review posing a counter-majoritarian difficulty or being a deviant institution. And I think these have disfigured much of constitutional scholarship, especially that by law professors. And indeed, I recently published a book whose title, Securing Constitutional Democracy, pays tribute to Walter's analysis. Thank you, Walter, for your clear-headed and wise formulation. Second, inspired by Walter's penchant for storytelling, I offer a fictional anecdote that will play off of what Mark just said. No doubt many of you have heard Walter tell the anecdote about Felix Frankfurter and James Bradley Thayer. It is said that whenever a new justice would arrive at the Supreme Court, Justice Frankfurter, ever the professor, would call on him, give him a copy of Thayer's essay, which he thought was the greatest work in the history of constitutional law, and admonish him to read it again, and read it again. Well, I wish Walter's former student, Sam Alito, class of 72, would do the same with Walter's Constitutional Democracy. Not just whenever a new justice arrives, but I wish you'd take it around to the currently sitting justices. Okay. Now, Preparing criticism of Walter's book, I confess, has been the most difficult assignment of my life as a professor. How can you criticize Walter's book when he's so obviously right in everything he says? So instead of criticizing it, I'll praise three aspects of his account of constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance, and then I'll put three corresponding questions to him, questions that point to fruitful further lines of inquiry. Now, in American constitutional interpretation, Walter, along with his humble co-authors, who are all sitting here in the room, conceived the enterprise of constitutional interpretation on the basis of three fundamental interrogatives. What is the Constitution? Who may authoritatively interpret it? And how ought it to be interpreted? Walter's idea of constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance fosters more comprehensive and comprehending views on all three interrogatives, what, who, and how, than do conventional accounts, especially originalist accounts. Now, my first point concerns Walter's important and insightful emphasis upon the idea of maintenance itself. This idea underscores that the Constitution is not a machine that would go of itself. Instead, it is a scheme that requires maintenance and repair to make it work. Walter's account emphasizes the place of courts in the larger institutional scheme of courts, legislatures, and executives sharing authority and responsibility to interpret the Constitution so as to maintain the system. And furthermore, Walter's idea of maintenance is more comprehensive and comprehending than interpretation conceived as doing backward-looking historical research into relatively concrete original meanings and then preserving those meanings against change. So far, so good. I confess, though, that I do have a reservation about the term maintenance. Maintenance may sound like greasing the joints, giving the engine a tune-up, plugging some holes. It may even encompass working out or correcting some minor flaws in the design, all is necessary to keep the machine going. So conceived, though, maintenance may not sound hospitable to perfectionist or philosophic or aspirational understandings like interpreting the Constitution so as to make it the best it can be, or elaborating constitutional commitments through making philosophic judgments. But I'm relieved that Barber conceives maintenance so as inviting or even requiring such understandings. Put another way, maintenance may sound more like a trade than an art. And we should recall here another one of Walter's trademark formulations, the art of constitutional interpretation. So my first question, Walter, is what is the relationship between constitutional maintenance and the art of constitutional interpretation? For we may need a fuller account of how constitutional maintenance includes the art of interpreting the Constitution so as to make it the best it can be. Now, Sot and I have traveled down this road somewhat in our forthcoming book, Constitutional Interpretation, the Basic Questions, in which we defend a philosophic approach, but much work remains to be done. So put another way, Walter, now that you've finished your book on constitutional democracy, I regret to say that we need you to do your book on the art of constitutional interpretation, or get somebody to do it, okay? Now, the second point stems from the fact already noted that Walter's idea of constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance encourages a broader view of what is the Constitution and how to interpret it than do conventional accounts, in particular originalist accounts. It fosters a salutary concern for furthering the purposes of the constitutional order instead of backward-looking interpretation of narrowly conceived clauses or original understandings from a litigation-oriented perspective. Now, one of the great things about Walter's work is that it is, as I would put it, unfailingly post-originalist. I won't say anti-originalist, I say post-originalist. Now, originalists in the United States piously proclaim that interpretation necessarily entails originalism, or that interpreters should, as Walter puts it, try to return to the founding to think the thoughts founders were thinking. Walter's erudite exercise in comparative constitutional law exposes their provincialism. He powerfully retorts that this view is, and I quote him here, pretty much restricted to the United States. Now, originalists might say that they, too, believe in constitutional maintenance, but in the sense of preservation. They might say they endorse the classical interpretive justification of judicial review. Courts are to interpret the Constitution and to preserve it against encroachment by legislative and executive encroachment. So again, they might say that maintenance means preservation, and that is their conception. For example, Justice Scalia likes to say that the point of the Constitution is to preserve the original meaning of the Constitution and to prevent change. Indeed, he's written that the Constitution's whole purpose is to prevent, I'm quoting him here, whole purpose is to prevent change. And according to Scalia, a society that adopts a Bill of Rights is skeptical that evolving standards of decency mark progress and that societies always mature as opposed to rot, his words. So here's my second question. What is the difference between Walter's sense of maintenance and this originalist understanding of preservation against change? I think that would be a worthwhile topic for another book, or at least dissertations for worthy graduate students. And we should acknowledge that much work remains to be done here in fending off the predictable originalist charges that what Walter would call maintenance is actually revision or subversion, those are Robert Bork's favorite words for it, or destruction or rotting, Scalia's terms, rather than the proper preservation, as they would see it, of the Constitution against change. Now, the third point concerns the fact that Walter's idea of constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance fosters a broader view of who may interpret than do conventional accounts. Walter's account underwrites a healthy, vigorous departmentalism. That is, sharing interpretive authority and responsibility among courts, legislatures, and executives, as opposed to conventional accounts of judicial monopoly or at least judicial supremacy, especially of the sort we've seen by the, as I would put it, the hubristic Rehnquist court. Walter wisely observes that despite the claims of judicial monopoly or judicial supremacy, the actual practice of most arrangements in fact produces some form of departmentalism. He also wisely argues that some form of departmentalism is healthier than having courts be the ultimate, if not the exclusive interpreter. And we should note that Walter's conception of constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance not only broadens what courts' responsibilities are beyond conventional understandings of interpretation, but also broadens what legislatures and executives' responsibilities are. For legislatures and executives, on his view, share in the responsibility of interpretation and of maintenance. And this leads to my third question. What are legislatures and executives to do when they interpret and maintain the Constitution, and how does this differ from what courts do? In particular, should legislatures and executives just keep on doing whatever it is they've been doing while we reconceptualize whatever that is as coming within constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance? Again, should legislatures and executives just keep on doing whatever it is that they've been doing while we reconceptualize whatever that is as coming within constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance? Or does Walter contemplate that under departmentalism, legislatures and executives are obligated to change their ways to comport with more demanding responsibilities of constitutional interpretation as constitutional maintenance? So here's the final line of further inquiry. I think we need to formulate richer, more concrete accounts of what it is that legislatures and executives do and should do when they engage in constitutional interpretation, including maintenance, and how it differs from as well as resembles what courts do. Now here, of course, Keith Whittington's account of legislatures and executives as engaging in construction helps, although I think Walter rightly rejects Keith's distinction between construction and interpretation. I think Walter's account clearly points us in the right direction, though, and charts promising paths for further inquiry. So thank you, Walter, for all that your book accomplishes in raising these difficult and important matters, and thank you for pointing the way to all the work that remains to be done.
Our next speaker is
Thank you, Kim. Well, Walter's book's only been out a short time. In fact, he only got his copy, he said, this week. So I'm going to, in a second, just focus on what I think its distinctive character is for those of you that understandably haven't read it. But I already got an indication this morning, Walter, that it's going to be a big success. I went over to Firestone Library to do some things, and I checked the catalog, and they, of course, did buy your book. And so that's a good sign. But a better sign is that it's already been stolen from the Firestone Library. So you can't actually get it over there. Walter's book covers an awful lot of territory, but I just want to focus on a sort of broad picture for those of you that haven't read it. Most people think of constitutional law as what courts and judges do, or the study of their opinions and so forth. And this book is not about that. This book, it isn't in its title, and it's not in its content. It's really about regime design. His preferred type of regime is one that he has labeled constitutional democracy. So he asks, how can such a regime actually be designed, and how can it be maintained? And so it's very important to know that this is not law. Law is a component of a larger project of regime design. Law is a piece of a larger puzzle. And at the end of so much of the book is written around a dialogue for the creation of such a design for an imaginary country. And then the last third of the book is written in more standard analytic form, discussing such questions as how would such a then designed regime be maintained. And we've been asked today to talk more about that last part. When Walter talks about maintenance, he emphasizes things such as how to reconcile prudence and principle, or how to contend with the needs of emergency power on the one hand and the protection of civil liberties and the like on the other. And I must say, Walter's argument is far more nuanced than, say, Mark's account of war in his brief remarks was before. I think when you read Walter, you get the real sense that there are genuine claims on both sides of that ledger, so that anybody who's concerned with regime maintenance has to really take seriously serious threats to a polity. But at the same time, if you only were concerned with such threats, you might undermine the polity itself. So Walter spends a lot of time on that. One way to elaborate, though, the problem of maintenance that isn't exactly what Walter says, but a way that I think actually is consonant or consistent with his intention, is to suggest also that maintenance involves an activity that might be called diagnostic or diagnosis. The diagnostician has to figure out what the polity looks like such that one would know whether it was healthy or ill, to use the medical analogy. And following up the medical analogy, you might find genetic deformities in the polity. You might find the polity actually was born with certain deformities that need to be attended to. Or you might find that it has some acquired diseases. Or you might find that it was born with genetic predispositions that weren't exactly deformities, but over time manifested themselves as problems, as they do in the human body. And I think all of those things are actually true of the American polity, and I wanted to say a word about that in the spirit of Walter's discussion on maintenance. With respect to a possible genetic deformity, Barber mentioned the founders' inability, or at least of some of them, to make civic education and public education in the form of a national university a constitutive part of a regime that over time seemed to need it. So that might be an example of that. As an acquired possible disease, one might think of political parties, which were not actually designed as part of the formal constitutional architecture, but have had the effect in our time of of taking the ambition of office holders away from the institutions to which they were supposed to be wedded and attaching them to parties to the detriment of those institutions. But thirdly, I find most interesting, and I just want to spend my brief remarks explaining what it means. You might think of a genetic problem that grows over time, the legalization of politics in America. And I think this one is particularly interesting because it's the one that I think is most important and most profound, and it's also the one that is most repaired by Walter's book. If Walter's book is anything, it's a book designed to replace an overly legalistic understanding of the American political order with a more robustly political understanding, including a more robustly political understanding of the legal part of the American political order. So what do I mean by legalization? Well, for example, in recent times, the President and the Congress have increasingly deferred to courts over issues that they had previously contested themselves. But more interestingly, I think, and I'll take my brief moments indicating that as an example of this notion of legalization, the impeachment process since the time of Andrew Johnson has been understood as essentially a legal process with the impeachment of presidents, with the president's deeds being accessible only on the standards of ordinary crimes in the criminal legal code. So that if a president commits a misdeed that can be categorized successfully as a crime, the president is impeachable. But if it is outside that ambit and is simply bad judgment or abuse of office in some other way, presidents aren't impeached. And the reason for this is that the Constitution seems loaded with text that suggests a very rich analogy with the criminal legal process. So articles are fashioned, managers of the House are appointed to actually prosecute the case, the Senate is turned into a trial, the Chief Justice sits and presides over the trial, and an elaborate analogy to the legal process is created by the Constitution, understandably giving people the sense that it is a legal process. But an analogy is something that's like something else. It's not something that is something else. And so presidents, in fact, can't be sent to jail for the crimes that they are impeached for if they were successfully convicted. And that would, if they were able to be sent to jail, it would violate the double jeopardy provision because they can, in fact, be tried and convicted for ordinary crimes once they were removed from office, which is all that the impeachment process could do. So why does the Constitution analogize the impeachment process to a legal one and a criminal legal one if, in fact, it's a political one? I think the answer to that is by analogizing the process to a legal one, the design intends a political process that is different, more elevated than ordinary politics, but is politics nevertheless. That's why an analogy, but it's also why not a strict symmetry between the impeachment process and the legal process. And the reason it does this is because the separation of powers design of the polity would not make sense if one, and does not make sense today, without a robust understanding, a robust political understanding of the impeachment process. If one is really upset today, as a number of people seem to be in this room, with the conduct of, including the author of this book, with the conduct of President Bush in the war on Iraq, I submit that most of your complaints should be directed toward the Congress even more than toward the President himself. That isn't to say that the President shouldn't be criticized, but those criticisms should be directed to Congress's failure to exercise its power to retrospectively evaluate presidential action. And why I stress that point is, from the standpoint of regime design, we want an executive that is biased to action. We want to create a situation in which executives take risks. We want to create a situation in which executives can take emergency actions if emergencies were genuinely necessary. And obviously, if you have such a system, you're going to have the possibility of presidents exercising poor judgment or taking actions when they weren't really necessary. And so what do you do about that? The answer of the original design was you encourage and make possible presidents to take those actions by giving them certain prospective advantages in the system, but you give Congress retrospective advantages. Without Congress's retrospective advantages, the president's enormous power simply cannot be justified. But Congress can only have retrospective advantage, including the power of hearings and subpoenas and all the things that they do, if they have a robust possibility of impeachment. So the impeachment process, the way it's actually developed in American politics, illustrates the legalization of American politics over time and some of the defects of that for the conduct of politics in America today. And one of the great merits of this book is it's the first of, I hope, many salvos in an effort to actually repoliticize American politics.
Yes, I'm familiar with this. As my daughter pointed out recently, why am I always in the caboose of any line at school? Sorry, that'll be true for the rest of your life. Get used to it. Before I get to the core of my remarks, I wanted to note a couple of brief stories about Professor Murphy which connect to the book. And the first was when I applied for a job at Princeton. For those of you who don't know, a norm within political science is to send a writing sample with an application for a faculty position, and usually that involves a chapter or maybe 2 chapters of the dissertation, which is what I'd done. But then I got a phone call from Princeton saying, well, could you send the rest of the dissertation? And we want to see the whole thing, which no one else had done in any other jobs I applied to, but I packed it all up and sent it in. And then I was invited in to interview at Princeton for the job. And when I arrived, I was given back this package, which was the dissertation, covered with red marks throughout the entire thing. And my first thought was, this is not a good sign that this is how we're starting out. And I was told that it was Walter Murphy who had read the dissertation and had marked it up in this fashion, but that I shouldn't take that too badly because this is a sign that he actually likes you. So that was good. But I note, and so that certainly improved what ultimately became my first book, and I appreciate very much Professor Murphy's willingness to take the time and effort to give such a robust commentary on what was really just a job candidate passing through. But I notice from a footnote in this book that Professor Murphy still thinks I'm wrong in most of the things I said in that book, which is unfortunate on his part. But I still have faith that he will see the light and change his views at some point in the future. Once I arrived at Princeton, though, I was given the responsibility in part of teaching a graduate seminar that Professor Murphy had taught under the title of Constitutional Theory. And I had my own ideas about what you might do with a course with that kind of title and the description that went along with it. But I asked if I could see a copy of the syllabus that Professor Murphy used because I was curious as to what the course would look like and then what the expectations might be about what I ought to do in the future. And so I received a packet of material that was the syllabus for the course, which was extraordinarily long, filled with lengthy lists of readings, both required and suggested, and many essays sprinkled throughout about constitutional theory. And moreover, it was filled with discussions of the relationship between civilian governments and the military, about parliamentary and presidential representative structures and democracy, about different voting arrangements and proportional representation and how they ought to be structured and what the consequences were. And I thought, I've been hired for the wrong job because this is not at all something that I would feel at all comfortable or competent to teach. And all that kind of material, the kind of material that he was conveying to students in those graduate seminars on these wide-ranging subjects, which really expanded across the breadth of political science, are very much reflected in this book. I see many of those same readings now in the footnotes of Constitutional Democracy as Professor Murphy is working through his thinking about how a constitution should be structured, how democracies actually work and sustain themselves over time. And so the book really does reflect a wealth of learning and an unusually wide range of learning, but I think all of which is necessary for understanding the subject that Professor Murphy is hoping to understand and to convey in this book. It's in the spirit of the concerns expressed in the book, especially this section on thinking about constitutional maintenance, that I want to just raise a few thoughts on the problem of how you bind politics, in particular democratic politics, but how you bind politics to constitutional commitments that you've made, and thinking through the problems then that face a constitutional designer in the first place on how to make those commitments real and how they might sustain themselves over time, but also for those who have to live within those constitutional polities and hope to sustain and maintain, and one might even say preserve, those constitutional commitments over the course of time. Thinking about that, I want to suggest there are at least four threats to that process of constraining politics through constitutional commitments, and each one suggests a somewhat different kind of strategy for how you might deal with it. And the book is interesting in part for what it has to say about these kind of strategies and the threats that Professor Murphy sees to the sustainability of constitutional democracies over time. So the first of these might be called constitutional resistance. That is a problem of powerful political actors no longer being committed to the constitutional values and principles and commitments that had been vested in the system at the start. They're no longer committed to constitutionalism as such, or they're no longer committed to the specific set of constitutional principles, and as a consequence no longer wish to maintain fidelity with those principles any longer, and are willing to ignore them and throw them out. And this strikes me as probably the most serious kind of threat that you can have to an ongoing constitutional system is this willingness to simply dispense with the constitutional form, that at the end of the day, constitutionalism is only sustainable for those who wish to regard it as sustainable. You have to buy into the project of constitutionalism if it's going to be successful over time. Nonetheless, it's possible that I think that you might be able to respond to this kind of problem in various ways, partially through questions of constitutional design. For example, it would be valuable at least to be able to shed light and illuminate those moments and those actors who might engage in that process of constitutional resistance. You want that resistance to be as visible and as transparent as possible, such that it becomes easier to mobilize opposition to it, so that those who actually are continuing to be committed to the constitutional project that they began with can recognize those who are resistant to that project and can take action to try to sustain their values against those who would choose to ignore them. But that also requires that there be those who are interested and willing to mobilize. And that is, you have to sustain the kind of civic culture that we've known before that trains people and educates people to think about the kinds of constitutional commitments that they're engaged in, and to have a set of constitutional commitments that people in general, and importantly people who are politically important, continue to regard as valuable and worth preserving over time. That is, it's only possible to mobilize on behalf of constitutional values to the extent that people generally still adhere to those values and think that they're worth preserving or maintaining or continuing to discuss and try to live by. And that ultimately a constitutional system needs a way of not simply establishing itself, founding itself once and for all, but continuing a process of getting people to buy in to the constitutional project that had been initiated perhaps some distant time in the past. Secondly, there's also a problem of constitutional forgetfulness, which I think is easily overlooked, but nonetheless potentially quite important. That is that both the policy-making process, the process of engaging in politics and making law and making policy under a constitution, as well as the Constitution itself, may be complex, with a consequence that may be relatively easy to forget in the moment in which you're engaged in trying to actually make policy as to what exactly all the constitutional implications of what it is you're doing might actually be, and how it is that you can best act to preserve constitutional commitments, even as you also try to solve the specific policy problem that you're trying to solve. Here, unlike the problem of resistance, there's no real conscious view of a desire to set aside the Constitution or ignore the Constitution. There's not a conscious rejection of constitutional values, but simply a lack of recognition of the relevance of constitutional values for what it is that you're doing at the time. There's seem at least a couple of ways of trying to deal with this problem of constitutional forgetfulness, and one of which is to encourage the design of institutions and actors within a system that have specialization or expertise in constitutional values per se. Their particular job is to focus on constitutional values even as others are trying to engage in other tasks. There's some division of labor that puts to some a particular responsibility for sustaining these values even within the complexity of the larger political project is useful for the system as a whole. So even though you want a constitutional system in which everyone recognizes some responsibility to engage in the constitutional project and adhere to it, it may also be the case that you still need specialized institutions that have particularized concerns with sustaining constitutional commitments over time, even in the face of other kinds of political pressures that come to bear. But one thing that's notable about dealing with this kind of problem of constitutional forgetfulness from this perspective is that while judicial review, for example, is a natural kind of institutional response to this kind of difficulty, the form of the judicial review needs to take in order to address this problem is one that's really quite limited. That is what Jeremy Waldron, for example, has called a weak form of judicial review. That is, what you need is simply someone that can call attention to the fact that there are constitutional values being implicated in the policy that's being made, that can remind people of the necessity of paying attention to the constitutional value at the moment, who can explain the ways in which the constitutional principle is implicated in a particular action, and then you can count on political actors to actually fix the problem to the extent that the problem is one of forgetfulness rather than, for example, resistance. That you don't need a power to actually void policies that are in conflict with the Constitution. You merely need a power to be able to call attention to constitutional problems as they arise. Third, and somewhat relatedly, is a problem of constitutional neglect. That is to say, not conscious resistance to constitutional values, but also not simply a forgetfulness about constitutional principles, but an unwillingness to pay the full political cost that might be associated with sustaining constitutional values in the moment. That is to say, political actors may well find that even though they recognize that there may be constitutional difficulties with the actions that they're taking, and while they may still be overall committed to the constitutional principles that they see implicated in those policies, they may well nonetheless think that they do not themselves want to take the action that would be necessary to sustain those constitutional principles in the moment. They're willing to trade off certain sets of constitutional commitments in favor of more short-term political gains, for example, whether those gains be ones of achieving a certain policy objective, maintaining national security, or winning a particular election. One obvious, again, institutional response to this is, again, judicial review, which has the value of specializing in thinking about these constitutional commitments, but notably in this kind of context, simply calling attention to the constitutional failures is not sufficient. That in order to respond to this kind of difficulty, you need an institution that not only is going to pay attention to constitutional principles and focus attention on constitutional principles, but one that's actually capable of taking action on those principles and setting aside the actions of others. To the extent that you think that political leaders, political actors may be tempted to trade off long-term constitutional commitments for short-term political gains, you need institutions that are more insulated from precisely those kinds of pressures, that we need to bring back in the value of a strong form of judicial review that's capable of nullifying laws, not necessarily because we want institutions that are anti-democratic or opposed to democratic commitments and preferences generally, but because we want institutions that are insulated from the other kinds of pressures that are true of politics generally, in order to focus solely on and be able to take action solely on these problems of constitutional values and principles. And finally, let me just note a problem of constitutional contestation. That is, even though we may have a set of constitutional values and principles within the constitutional polity at any given moment, we may well disagree about what exactly they require in any particular context. The other things I mentioned are all problems that occur within a context in which you know what the constitutional commitments are, you know what the principle actually requires, but instead you have various kinds of problems of actually adhering to that principle, even though you know what it means. But one recurring problem within constitutional politics generally is that we don't always agree on what the constitutional principle is, that what exactly the commitments require in the moment. And I should note that I think it's less obvious than what the correct constitutional response or institutional response ought to be under those kinds of circumstances. If you think that a primary problem that you have or difficulty that you have within a polity is disagreement, serious disagreement about what exactly the nature of our commitments are, what exactly our principles require, it's not easy to recur, for example, to judicial review to solve this problem as we might think was necessary to solve problems of constitutional neglect or constitutional forgetfulness. Because in this context, emphasizing the value of judicial review as a particular organ for maintaining constitutional commitments over time really means entrenching one set of understandings and one set of commitments over that of others who are equally committed to the constitutional project, equally sincere about their constitutional understandings, but who happen to disagree with those who happen to be able to control the judiciary in a particular moment. It strikes me that in order to deal with problems of constitutional contestation in this way and problems of serious disagreement about our constitutional commitments, that we have to rely on politics itself, that we want politics to be organized precisely around those disagreements and to try to mobilize political support on behalf of our favorite constitutional commitments rather than, in this case, to turn to some more insulated institution and hope that that institution will entrench and realize our particular preferences or our particular understandings of these constitutional values rather than those of our opponents. And I think Professor Murphy's book is very useful for trying to think through and encourages us generally to try to think through these kinds of problems of constitutional design, to think seriously about the kinds of threats that arise within a constitutional system and what the most appropriate way of addressing those threats might be in order to sustain the constitutional project in the future. And there's a great deal of wisdom there, not only conceptually about thinking about the features of constitutions and how they operate, but also empirically and what lessons we can learn from the past about how constitutions have actually operated and what kinds of constitutional options have proven the most successful over time.
Panelists have actually followed directions extraordinarily well, been fast-paced and been different from each other. This is the wonders of email. Everyone was able to communicate a bit about what they wanted to say in advance. And so what you've seen is a whole variety. It's a bit like the multiple ways of looking at an elephant, you know, where you've now seen different pieces of the book. We have a few minutes for questions to the presenters about their presentations. We'll then take a break and have the ultimate discussant, namely Walter Murphy, respond to the comments. But first we have some time for questions from the audience directed to the panelists about their remarks. Yes, Ezra.
I don't have any questions. I just want to make one remark about Walter's book, which I think didn't quite come through in your presentations, because I think that... Thank you. You all know Walter as an American constitutional expert, and I think that Jeff Tulis came quite close, actually, by saying the book is actually about constitutional design, and I think that captures very, very well the book, but it does bear emphasizing that Walter actually is a comparativist, very, very much so. And I think that that's often ignored, and that is probably also what enriches his work on the United States, you see. So I don't think it's just a sideline that he kind of does on the side. It's, I think, very, very important to the corpus of his work.
Yes. Actually, if I can turn that into a question to address about the book, since I'm the actual... I think I'm more the comparativist on the panel than anyone else. So let me say something about that and add to it. And it's certainly the case, I mean, not only that the book is full of rich comparative examples. In fact, there are probably more examples of every place else in the world than the U.S. But it's also that the agenda of the book is very much driven by the kind of problems that come up that the U.S. has often been spared. So one of the ways you can see why, for example, constitutional maintenance is so very difficult is because the U.S. has had a relatively charmed history over its existence, and if you only look at the American constitutional order, you might have a very truncated sense of the kinds of issues and the kinds of problems that might be encountered. So one of my favorite chapters in the book, because I work on Eastern Europe, is the chapter called Dealing with Disposed Despots. Now, how to put it, depending on your political views, you may think the U.S. actually deals with this problem all the time, or you may think the U.S. has actually never had to deal with this problem. Certainly the U.S. has not had to deal with this problem in some time, where there's been such a regime change that all of the leaders of the past regime have suddenly become, shall we say, not necessarily devotees of the new constitutional order. And one of the problems that Walter discusses very sensitively and very well is the question of how it is that a society that has gone through a regime change, that has a new constitution, deals with the problem of the despots that preceded them. Now, one thing that's very interesting about this chapter in the book is that it's not in the first part about constitutional design. It's actually in the section on constitutional maintenance. And therein lies a tale about the way Walter thinks about this problem. Basically, what Walter says is that this is not just a problem that's about how a system starts. It's a problem that really goes to the heart of what a constitutional system will be. And if I may quote him from, this is page 458 of the book, if any of you have it, he says, "For those people who think both that justice is not an empty word and that it differs from revenge, which is one of the motivations people might have in dealing with despots upon constitutional change, the moral problems surrounding whether, how, and how much to punish disposed despots are shrouded in mist. Some of that mist may lift." Walter's doing the lifting. He puts it in the passive voice. "Some of that mist may lift with a realization that justice looks forward as well as backward." And so he constructs the problem really not as a backward-looking problem of what you do about those folks, right? But instead, it's a forward-looking problem about what a regime can be. And so the way a regime deals with the awful regime that preceded it is in some sense a guide to how it is that a regime is going to think about maintaining itself into the future. Now, one of the reasons why I love this chapter is that I worked for 4 years in the 90s at the Hungarian Constitutional Court, and one of the things the Hungarian Constitutional Court used to say, and Walter actually quotes from some of the decisions of that court, was that the thing that characterized the revolution in Hungary in 1989 was not its sharp break from the past, but instead the court and the constitutionalists in Hungary thought of themselves as engaging in what they called a rule of law revolution. What did they mean by the rule of law revolution? They said the thing that distinguishes us from our predecessors is that our predecessors would have round up and shot everybody. And we don't do that. Because from the moment we take charge, from the moment that our new regime begins, we believe in the rule of law, we don't believe in retroactive legislation, we don't believe in after the fact creating things as crimes that weren't crimes at the time, and the thing that will characterize us from here on in is that we are a constitutional regime. It's that kind of moment that Walter spotlights, and it's that kind of sensibility he brings to the chapter on dealing with disposed despots, a problem that, like I said, has not really been the central problem of the American constitutional order for all kinds of lucky reasons of American history, but it is a problem that one has to think about in dealing with most constitutional regimes in the world. And so just to add to Ezra's point and to sort of further the sense that this is really a book full of rich examples and really fundamentally about comparative politics, the agenda of the book is driven by both historical actual problems and theoretical insight that could only be gained by looking at a wide variety of constitutional systems. Yes?
I haven't read the book, I'm sorry, but I don't have it. But what I don't understand is we are a republic, not a democracy. So I wondered why he said constitutional democracy instead of constitutional republic.
Does anyone want to, should we save that question for Walter, or someone want to take it up on the panel?
Well, I can ask it later if you want me to.
We're going to give that question to Walter. How about that? So we'll put that on.
Now or later?
How about later? We'll let you. We're going to save always the best for last. So you're not. Bill Allen.
I want to pose a question which I suppose will be fully answered for me when I do read the book. But the panelists' presentations came sufficiently close to it that it seems to me appropriate to ask it when it's imminent. Everyone talked about responsibility for constitutional maintenance. Other factors as well, but particularly constitutional maintenance. But the conversations seemed to pause on the responsibilities of office holders for constitutional maintenance. Some came closer than others to penetrating beneath that. But no one actually robustly engaged the question of the citizen's responsibility for constitutional maintenance. And I'm very interested to see some attempt to wrestle with that, and particularly with this one aspect in mind. I'm not certain that the work of Walter, as illustrated here, may not bear more, the work of Walter, the book, may not bear more importantly on the question of constitutional maintenance than endless court decisions, legislative decisions, or executive decisions, though I'm quite sure I can predict that neither Walter nor I will ever again hold significant public office. So address the question of the role of the people in constitutional maintenance, and perhaps taking Abraham Lincoln into account, who seemed to give them great responsibility.
Sure, Jim.
There is a role. That's the short answer. The longer answer, for the longer answer, certainly read the book. The part of the discussion of making citizens is concerned with establishing a base of citizenry, a social foundation in a sense, for maintaining constitutional democracy. There is, Jim mentioned that it was not Walter's position that the Constitution of the United States, just as an example, but that the Constitution of the United States created institutions that would go of themselves. They require attentive care and maintenance, not simply by their occupants, erstwhile, but also by citizens themselves. Now, what Walter recognizes is there are citizens and there are citizens. There are citizens who are devoted, I think it's not too strong a word, to the values and sustaining the constitutional order, and who are keenly active in the enterprise of maintaining the constitutional order. But there may not, in terms of percentage of population, be that many citizens who are who act at that level, and so there is a foundation. There is at least there are a couple of classes of citizens, at least, who may be somewhat attentive, but perhaps not devoted, but at least attached to the order. Now, the problem for constitutional democracy, and correct me if I'm misstating the position, the problem of constitutional democracy from the standpoint of citizens is that there is in almost every political order a subset of persons or citizens who are disaffected. And the challenge of one challenge of the order is to deal with that disaffection, not simply through force or coercion, but through other means. Now, Barber has written on issues that are connected with this, ensuring that people have the means for attaching to the order. Even the less well-off of us have the means for attaching to the order. And Walter is keenly sensitive to this problem. But I'll stop here and let others respond.
Jim, you want to force on? No?
The short answer is yes.
there is a section on interpretation by citizens.
I would just add to that slightly, and I think that there's a variety of roles of citizens, and one relates it up to thinking about to what extent this is a republic, although I'm not sure necessarily in contrast to democracy, but one way in which the Republican government might be emphasized is a government that part derives from the people. And thus the constitutional order in the first place has to be founded on and approved by the people and arise from their own set of commitments and concerns. And that was certainly very much a concern of the founders as to how do you design institutions not only that you think are right and a set of commitments that you think are right, but then how do you win support for that politically such that the people more generally are willing to buy into that set of commitments, adhere to it, and construct a government that's going to operate onto it. Not only how do you draft a constitution, but how do you get it ratified at one level. But in addition, once you have an ongoing constitution, this question in part reminds me of James Madison's reaction to the Supreme Court's decision in McCulloch v. Maryland. McCulloch v. Maryland was a decision the Court Chief Justice John Marshall had rendered approving of the Bank of the United States, which Madison and his allies thought far exceeded the chartering of the Bank of the United States by the federal government, far exceeded the legitimate powers of the federal government. And Madison complained that Marshall had erased the bright lines of the Constitution and had created a consolidated, all-powerful federal government if you were to take his opinion seriously. Madison's response to that was to think that what's at stake then, when Marshall's opinion and what the Jeffersonians had to do in response was to see who was going to win the hearts and the minds of the people at the end of the day. Was Marshall going to persuade the people? And he certainly thought of his opinion, as he did many of his opinions, as being public documents that is trying to shape the civic culture more generally and shape people's understandings broadly of what the Constitution means. Is he going to be successful in persuading them such that they will put new kinds of demands on the government, empower other kinds of elected officials, but also place demands on those elected officials to behave in certain kinds of ways? Or can you persuade the people to refrain from using the power that Marshall was attempting to give them, that voters would not put those kinds of demands on their elected representatives to do things that would put pressure on inherited constitutional commitments? And I think Madison correctly understood that at the end of the day, in order to sustain constitutional commitments over time, not only do you have to have the right kinds of institutions in place, but you have to also ensure that you don't have the wrong kinds of political pressures constantly be put on those who occupy political office, such that they are constantly tempted to violate those constitutional commitments that you've established to start with.
Well, we're now at the moment when we have some coffee and refreshments in the back of the room, and then we save the best for last, which is Walter himself, who will come and talk to us about his reactions to the panel and his thoughts on the book. So a 15-minute break. There's refreshments in the back, and we'll see you for Walter.